every evaluation that you make in the hiring process, whether that's reviewing someone's resume, going out and collecting a reference, getting even a referral, doing an interview, those are all assessments.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the RevOps Recruiters podcast. This episode is actually the second part of a conversation we had with Neil Morelli. He's a PhD in IO psychology, and we're talking about the science of hiring. So if you haven't heard the first half of the conversation, go back and check out the last episode, and then come back here and grab the second half.
Let's move on to assessments.
Yeah.
What role does an assessment play in the hiring process? Let's start there.
Yeah, so I know I'm biased because I work for an assessment software company.
Sure.
It's called Codility. We assess software engineers. We do it for some of the biggest tech companies around. And so I'm a very firm believer in the importance of an assessment in your process to try to quantify, to bring some objectivity and gather some data, essentially, for the decisions that you're making.
And we're a fan of assessments, too.
Yes.
We
Yeah,
do that
we
as a
are.
part of our process as
Okay,
well. So
good.
we're on the same side of the fence as you are.
Right. So I think, though, assessments can be kind of vilified sometimes, though, because they're this outside instrument or tool, or they're trying to supersede my own judgment, and I'm kind of like taking on the persona of maybe a hiring manager or a leader who's evaluating whether or not to use an assessment. So I would just say to that it really comes down to making sure, again, you're starting with that strong contract of what this job entails with the job description. You've identified the things that we think will contribute or predict success in this job. And then we're coming up with a standardized process for evaluating whether or not you have those things. Doesn't that sound like a process that you'd want to include?
Absolutely.
You would take that kind of due diligence and that approach in any other part of your business. If you're building a product, you'd go out and understand, here are my requirements, here are the needs of my customer. And then I would, do some iteration. I would collect data, and then I would see whether or not I'm meeting those goals. Same thing on the finance or marketing side.
Evaluating a vendor.
Exactly.
You do the same thing.
You'd set your criteria, and then
Right.
you'd come up with a process for gathering data on the basis of those criteria.
Sure.
Why is hiring different?
Right.
I think it has an emotional piece to it, and it also has an agency piece that people feel somewhat defensive over. So an assessment can kind of like threaten that sense sometimes. So that's just kind of briefly my view on where there's a friction sometimes when you bring up the word assessment.
Yeah.
But one thing I like to remind people a lot of is that every evaluation that you make in the hiring process, whether that's reviewing someone's resume, going out and collecting a reference, getting even a referral, doing an interview, those are all assessments. They're all evaluations.
Sure. Yeah.
An assessment, as we might think of it traditionally, is just a form. It's a method of collecting data. So it's a bank of items or questions, or it's some sort of work sample that we judge, the merits of it or the kind of the quality of it.
Right.
It's just a different form of assessment. So like, the more we can say these are all in the same category, on what basis or rationale are we implementing them? What are they designed to measure? And how do they complement the other pieces of our evaluation of our assessment process? Then I think it's a good kind of posture to have.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So when we think about assessments, are we focusing only on hard skills? Are we focusing on soft skills? Is there a perfect mixture of both of those? What should we be looking at? And let's say, let's think through it maybe through the lens of RevOps, right? Which is a somewhat technical role, right? There's got to be, so when we're thinking about assessment, walk me through hard skill versus soft skill.
Yeah, I think assessments can be helpful for both. And although I offer and work with a hard skills assessment platform, I think sometimes soft skills are where we need assessment. We need some kind of objective evaluation where it's not just your impression, but it's some sort of third source of truth that we can kind of come around and decide. Now, you have to be a good informed buyer around there. There's some snake oil when it comes to the soft skill assessments piece, but I think they're equally valuable for both of those skill sets. But I think on the hard skill side, that can really be important as sort of establishing that someone has the table stakes competencies to enter the job and be successful on day one. Like that's where you really want to set your assessment. You don't want to say, well, I need to assess someone in this, Salesforce instance that we have, this sort of custom thing, and if they don't know it to the nth degree, that's less helpful. But if you can demonstrate that they have those kind of minimum qualifications from a hard skill setting,
Sure.
then the soft skill assessment can really be a nice layer to add on some differentiation between candidates. And again, going back to the competencies that you're looking for, as long as those are well specified, then that can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Think about the soft skill versus hard skill. We tend to see that hard skill minimum needs to be there, right? There's a minimum qualification that needs to be there. But what we like to say a lot of times is your soft skill is what gets you there.
Yeah.
Right. So it's high potential. If you're a high potential candidate, you can take a little bit of that hard skill and you can maximize it over time.
Yeah.
If the company allows you to, if the company gives you the runway to do that, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times what we see is we have clients that go, no, we want this from day one. We want this experienced candidate. But to your point, it's the soft skills that really define that candidate's success long term, right? If you are high potential, if you have the right aptitude, you can take something and accelerate, right?
Yep.
From a hard skill perspective.
Yeah, usually, I'd say absolutely every candidate that we put forward to a company has the hard skills to do the role because we've done the assessment. Where they really stand out once they meet a hiring manager, oftentimes is the soft skills that they have.
Right.
And hopefully, going back to the previous conversation, it's not just I like this person, I feel like they're a quote unquote culture fit, but they truly have EQ, leadership, they've have experience in change management. Now we're trying to evaluate that from the standpoint of tell us stories, help us understand what you've done, but a tool like an assessment would do an even greater job. Yeah. So if I'm an organization and I'm saying, okay, I want to begin doing this, I heard you say, there's some out there that are not as good as others. How should I evaluate the quality of a soft skill assessment? Like what should I be looking at, or how do I find good ones to use? Because there's probably, if I Google assessment, there's probably a gazillion. So
yeah, I can give you some general parameters. Obviously the devil can be in the details sometimes, but the general things to look for, especially as someone that doesn't interact with assessments all day, maybe hasn't been trained in some of the background, looking for an IO psychologist that's on staff or is a part of the executive team, someone that was involved in the formation and the validation of that assessment. That's a really good flag that at least someone with that kind of perspective and background is bringing that to the tool set, to the instrument. So I think that's a big piece. Do they have a technical manual? And it might not be, hey, I'm going to sit down and read this thing, but if they've actually gathered some of the information that we know that there are standards and guidelines that an assessment should follow, if they've started to document those, at least just having one, if someone says, well, what do you mean a technical manual? That's a red flag to me. So I think that there are some good curation websites that will list out different vendors and different tools that would be, more behavioral, kind of psychometric in nature, kind of getting at the soft skill piece. And then obviously there are other vendors that kind of specialize on the hard skill side. So you might have to kind of patchwork or compile a portfolio or set of tools. But I think those are two good things to start to look for.
No, that's great. I remember when we were chatting with this a little bit earlier, you also mentioned just, does it come from kind of an academic background versus I just decided I'm going to build one and try to monetize it, right?
Right. And, the academic tools or the ones that have that background, some of them can feel very academic. And if they're just an academic tool that's sort of been reskinned, then there are pros and cons to that.
Sure.
But if, yes, there's some research or some literature that's been done, there's some original studies on the framework or the constructs that they're measuring in the assessment, that's obviously a good sign that someone's done their homework.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier a couple of websites in a previous conversation. So if you can provide some of those, we'll put those in the show notes, and that way people can go and check out just some places that have some of those curated locations where they can look at.
Yeah, so I'd recommend Talent Tech Labs.
Okay.
That's a good analysis of the assessment space.
Yeah.
Talent acquisition technology, essentially. So they look at the full kind of range of talent acquisition steps, from sourcing to selection and assessment to onboarding and all of that. But there's some good curation there.
Yeah.
I think it's a good place to start.
That's awesome.
Great. Well, so really what I hear you saying is do your homework, right? Be a good consumer of assessments. Don't just go out and buy one. Great. Well, let's move into the interview bucket. What are some of the best practices that you've seen in the interview process? Now, we do this day in and day out, but I'd love to hear a PhDIO's perspective on this.
Yeah, so I actually think, again, like the job description is a simple, familiar way to get good job analysis, evidence-based practices into setting up the spec. I think the interview is also a very good, familiar, simple place to add good assessment practice to your hiring process. And by that, I mean, we know structured interviews are one of the best or most predictive hiring tools. Like, we have research on that. We have data on that over, decades pretty much. So the more structured your interview can be, typically the better. Now, sometimes there's a lot of diminishing returns, and you have to be mindful of the context. But essentially, building more structure into your interview is a best practice, is a good place to be. What does structure mean? Well, it's more on the how are we collecting and evaluating the data that we're gathering from candidates, and what are the things that we're measuring. Yeah. So it's both on the what and the how. If we can add some more specificity, some more intentionality to either one of those things, then we're adding more structure to it. Yeah. You might have seen a structured interview guide before where it's like, say this, then ask this, then here's the follow-up, here's all the scoring rubrics and all of that. And I think some people can have an allergic reaction to that because they feel very like, I'm very constrained and all of that. So I do think there can be a continuum of the amount of structure. Now, if you're interviewing high volume kind of roles and you need that kind of standardization for proper kind of consistency and objectivity and comparisons, then you might want to be on the more structured side of that spectrum. If it's lower volume and it's as much about selling and building rapport with a candidate, maybe you can relax some of that structure, but at least going into the interview with a plan. That's a really good place to start with. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's huge. The plan side of it, right? And rather than just, I know we've had feedback from candidates that have told us, they said, I got into this interview and it felt like the person who I'm speaking with doesn't know who I am,
right? Has
never looked at any of my background. This is more of an inconvenience to them to do this interview, right? And that doesn't create a great feeling for that candidate going into that environment. So what does building that plan look like? And I think around most companies that we work with are going to do multiple interviews, right? And so should that team work together to build this cohesive plan across 4 different people that are going to be interviewing so that they're looking for the same things, looking for different levels of things? How does that work out?
Yeah, so I don't think you need to make every decision by committee necessarily. So I think there could be a primary driver of the process, maybe even someone like a talent acquisition specialist or a recruiter to say, hey, here's the plan. We've all kind of agreed on this is the job mandate. Here are the things that we're looking for. Going back to the job description again.
Right.
Then how are we going to assess or measure those things? Maybe 1 or 2 of those things we can do through a more kind of structured paper and pencil or computer-based assessment. And then these other 2 or 3 things, we really need that kind of interaction. We want to drill into someone's background, into their experiences. They want those behavioral interview questions to really flesh out whether or not you have those competencies. So then it could be saying, okay, we're for these first 3 or 4 interviews, we're going to measure these 2 or 3 things, and we've got the right overlap to where not every conversation is the exact
doesn't feel exactly the same
copy of
right.
like, tell me about yourself, and
right.
we just kind of do this chronological thing, and then I walk out with a good impression whether I like Adam or not.
Right.
So just again, kind of going in and saying like, it's a little bit of choreography, essentially, knowing who's going to do what and what are they looking at.
Yeah. I think the sequence is so critical, right? As you were talking, I was thinking about a situation several years ago where, I was working for another recruiting firm and we had a client and we were interviewing for a role. I think it was a key account manager. And these candidates, they had gone through several rounds of interviews with us. They were all ready. They were prepped. We had the profile down. We had all the insights. And then we passed them over to the client, and they had a talent acquisition person, HR person, do a scripted interview. And it was like we almost, basically the candidates were totally turned off by that, obviously. And so the sequence, of having a good sequence that builds up
Yep.
over time to where you as a candidate buyer are being shepherded through this journey, and it's keeping you in, and it's keeping you excited, and it's progressing well. It's not repetitive
Yep.
to what, your point there of having the same questions every single time. So it really is an art, but the sequence, that's what I'm hearing, is the sequence is so important.
And one other thing to that too is knowing what the purpose of the interview is before you've started. Right. And I think for a lot of leaders that have done interviews for years and years and umpteen times, they say, well, yeah, I know how this process goes. And what ends up happening? They tend to talk more than listen.
Yeah.
They tend to maybe try to sell a candidate, but then they're also kind of evaluating them in the background. Well, knowing whether or not that purpose of the interview is more of a sales motion, are you really trying to get that candidate engaged and help them learn about your business, and you're basically nurturing them in the process? Or is it to really evaluate them? And maybe the evaluation piece should be done by someone in particular, a couple types of roles or whatnot. But then really the selling piece, maybe your CEO shouldn't be evaluating your candidates. Maybe they should just be selling the candidate on the, why should you work with us? Where are we going as a business? Like, let's get you leaning in. Yeah. If they walk out and say, well, I don't like David, what are the criteria that they're evaluating on? I know that's not always an easy conversation, but at least that intentionality can really help.
It's really good.
I mean, I think of companies that we've watched that have done that really well. The senior leader who was doing the hiring, whether it was a CEO or an SVP or whatever, they were the ones that kind of came in as the closer, not the one trying to determine whether that person should or should not be there, right? They're trying to, at that point, this candidate's gone through 3, 4, 5 interviews. They've passed through all those gates. That senior leader is now getting them pumped up and excited about this opportunity and kind of closing the deal with them.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that works really well. What about, you talked earlier about competencies, and I loved how, we had a conversation where we talked about having an idea of what you need for this role. And we use the 2 examples of adaptability versus dependability. And so putting a number of questions around determining if this person had the competencies for the type of role that you need at that moment. And those two things are very different, adaptability versus dependability, right? So kind of walk me through how just the competencies and how you might evaluate, and how, not specifically how to create questions, but the idea of building a set of questions to try to determine, is this the type of candidate that we're looking for?
So I think this is where a definition for the label is really, really critical. And maybe this is somewhere where ChatGPT can help, a tool like that, where you say, hey, you're an organizational psychologist, or you are a business management consultant. How would you define adaptability for a business like this? And you can kind of give it that prompt, and it could provide a pretty good boilerplate definition. So I actually think that this is a good little use case of where you can rely on some external resource to do that. But the reason I mention that is because I could probably ask you, what does dependability look like for this role? And you would give me an answer. And then, I'd pull David aside and say, what does dependability look like for this role? And you'd probably give me an answer. I don't think that they would be completely overlapping.
Yeah, sure.
There might be 50, 60% overlap, maybe if you're really, really like dialed into one another and you have that same kind of frame of reference. That's why it's important to define what that competency is.
I love that.
And on top of it, if you want to go the full 9 yards, 10 yards, you can then say, well, what would an evaluation of a response be to this question? So if you could maybe come up with your own version of how you would want to ask whether or not someone is dependable or not. But how do you evaluate the answer? What's a good answer versus a bad answer? So I say all that to say that I think we kind of assume, or these terms are blurry, right? We have to get some handles, and that's what psychologists do. We're just labelers. Like, that's all we do. We just observe, take notes, collect data, and then we come up with labels, and we make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of that label. That can be huge, huge, huge for a process. If you've all kind of come to a consensus that these are the things that we need to measure, and there's a pretty clear definition of those, I think that puts you, above 90% of how most processes like this go. But kind of going back to your question, adaptability versus dependability, it really comes down to if one is more important than the other for a particular job, then you're obviously making that decision up front. You're really saying it's not both, because maybe sometimes those things can conflict.
Sure.
Right? They can be like at odds. You might find someone who's hyper dependable because they like that stability. They like to know what's expected of them. They need clear expectations, and they're just going to go and do, right? And you know that you give them something to do and they're going to go do it. But there could be someone that is higher on that adaptability dimension, and they're going to chart their own path. They might even, they're going to be juggling 5 balls. They might drop 2, but that's okay. But as long as they're kind of like, keeping things going, that's helpful. That's what you need. So you need someone that has that kind of creative, they don't have risk aversion,
Right.
they have risk acceptance, and some of the things might fall along the wayside because of that. It's hard to find someone that might be both of those things,
because
right?
they're almost two ends of a same spectrum. Yeah.
Exactly. So all that to say, going back to the labels, going back to what does this job require, you can start to negotiate and say what is really important for this job, and then you can evaluate someone on those criteria.
I think about the RevOps leader, strategic and tactical.
Right.
There is folks out there.
Yeah.
There are some really good folks.
Yeah.
And not every pairing of competencies has an inverse relationship. You can be high on some competencies, but typically certain competencies can kind of be polar, like they can kind of oppose one another. Right. So it might be that, hey, we're looking for both of these. It's going to be very hard to find someone who's maxed out both of them. It might be that they're kind of middle. They kind of balance each other that way.
Yeah. That makes sense. Well, man, this has been amazing. I love what you've shared. Let me ask you this. So the book that you alluded to, when is it available? What's the details around that? Because some of the folks listening may want to check that out.
Yeah. So it's coming out later this year. I want to say early fall.
Okay.
Some bit of the publishing process can kind of be a little bit loose sometimes, but it's a little alliterative. It's data-driven decision-making for the entrepreneurial ecosystem. That's a mouthful.
Wow. Okay.
It'll be in the show notes.
It'll be in the show notes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, when it does come out, be sure to let us know, and we'll make sure that we let everybody in our network know, because it sounds like it would be hugely valuable to the folks that are listening. So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for being on the show. It was awesome to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Great.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the RevOps Recruiters Podcast. If you enjoyed it, we'd love it if you subscribe. You can do so on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, if you've got feedback on things you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast, leave a comment on YouTube and we'll check it out there. Finally, if you're looking to make your first or next RevOps hire, we'd be happy to talk to you about that. You can schedule a time to connect with us on our website at www.revsearch.io. Again, thanks for listening.